So I think we could just sort of start. It's such a this is my first time hosting a salon in full disclosure, but I do spend a lot of my time in intellectual conversation. I'm on faculty at NYU as a professor of media, culture, and communication. That's kind of my day job. So that's a pretty broad span of things. My name is Erica Robles Anderson, and my particular background is in cultural history. I'm very interested in thinking about forms of collectivity and directions forward for thinking about how we could design for new forms of collectivity. And so I'm very happy to be in conversation, hopefully in some role of that process with Arunjay today, who there are so many wonderful things to say about you, but I think my intuition is that we should biographically let that unfold around the question of the generation. Arunjay, I wondered if you could give us a sense of, the book title is sort of pins a few things together, and so maybe you could unfurl them a little for us like a petal, right? How does generation come to be like a core component of the way you think about the state of affairs? Why hope, right? How do those two come together? And then maybe we can sort of fill out from there the other petals we'd like to explore as we think about economy and society and community.
Yeah, thanks, Erica, and really nice to meet all of you. Andy, I live in the UK as well, so it's good that a couple of us on this side of the pond. So, when I started writing the book, it was COVID, May 2020, and and this realization that I'd been working in financial inclusion for over a decade, and my industry in the previous 10 years had added 500 million people to bank accounts. And while that was good, they were all empty. And not only theirs, but another 3.5 billion people. So let's say half the world's population, they had nothing to fall back on when everything stopped. Because they were all living paycheck to paycheck on sustenance, just getting by. And when the world shut down, that was a huge problem for them. And so that's kind of when I realized that economic inclusion is really what we need. Financial inclusion is good and it's the first step, but unless you economically include people, then you have a problem, as is the case today. And in the last 40 years, the inequality has just been widening, and I guess Chip has a lot of background in that and a deep understanding. So as I was writing the book, but I didn't have the title in the beginning, it kind of dawned on me a few things. So one is that when you look at change that happens over time, it's typically a generation that comes and says, hey, I'm not happy about this. Okay, so what? It was done this way. Doesn't mean it has to be done. We need to perpetuate that and continue to do it that way. So this is kind of this generational shift. And so that was one way of looking at it, that we need, there's the generation that's going to make these changes. And a key thesis of the book is this rise in consciousness on why, that's kind of behind the driver of the change. That we're all a lot more conscious, be it to our actions or, just the climate, the planet, even the Me Too movement. And I think it's a great example of something that used to happen for centuries or millennia, like it was, and the decades before the movement rose. I mean, this was very prevalent in the workplace, but it was this rise in consciousness that really tipped the scale and said, like, this is not okay, and so that all of these things, the vegan movement and other things like that, all came in my view from this rise in consciousness. And that's what gives me hope, that if consciousness continues to rise and people make the small changes as a result of it, because again, if you look at veganism, no government, no religion, no business said, hey, why don't you become vegan, or anything like that. It was individual choices, one person at a time making a choice to be vegan. And today, you've got restaurants offering vegan options, you've got supermarkets offering, like business basically accommodate, kind of changed what they were doing to cater to this growing need of people. And so these small actions that we can make are really powerful, and collectively we can drive that change.
Okay, so since we haven't met, this is like a bit of a trapeze act, right? We'll see if this is like comfortable, but that means in public also we have to do a little bit of like, if the push is too hard or soft, let me know, right? Because the goal is really for us to get to explore well together. So
Absolutely.
the story that I just heard has a lot of the individual incentive model, which makes sense. Economics kind of has built a psychology around understanding those incentives and how to make change.
Mhm.
But the other side of the coin seems to be a growing awareness of how society, in your book you talk about growing up in the kind of the wake of Thatcher, right, which we all kind of co-share as a historical experience, and then recognizing that actually there's a lot of society, and that society has structures, organizations, institutions, firms, collectivities, movements. And so I'm wondering if the story, what happens to the story of consciousness, which is a very individually grounded story of like independent coin flips changing the equilibrium, when a question like generation comes into play, which is a social question of multiplicities and what makes those distinctions. How are you reconciling or taking a journey through what sounds to me like becoming a bit more heterodox than most economists are certainly willing to play through?
Yeah, so I think that's a fascinating question, and I think there's many threads to this. Ultimately, all of everything is just people. You know, government is for the people, by the people, and of the people. And even no matter who you elect, it's the people who have elected other people. They're not machines. They're not they're just people. And so even they have the opportunity to increase their consciousness and make better decisions for the world. Okay, they're more powerful than others, but at the end of the day, they're just another human being. So I think there's that. But collectively, to answer that earlier question, the movements and generations, like if you look at the millennial generation and you say, oh, millennials are lazy, they're entitled, and millennials is, or maybe more millennials, and millennials are like these helicopter parents. The parenting, if you look at that shift in parenting from one generation to the next, and I'm not saying one is better than the other, just highlighting the fact that this change has happened, and it's also broad. It's and that's because there's a ripple effect. Like, within your small circle, I mean, they say you're the average of the five people you surround yourself with, right? So that small circle, the bigger circle, and you keep talking about, and there's so much media now as well, right? So all of that influences people, and that brings together, kind of, not that everyone subscribes to the same ideologies, but it brings people together to kind of similar pathways. In so and talk about this thing about there are always going to be people who smoke, no matter what. And using that as an analogy, there are always going to be people who want to extract maximum rent, and they're super greedy. They only care about themselves. They're always going to exist. The question is, do we all need to be like that, or can enough of us be different, and therefore, you know, able to make a difference in total? So I can come on to more examples as we continue the conversation, but hopefully that kind of gives a sense of.
Yeah, totally. So maybe let's do that. Let's like, do you have a few like grounded examples that you would be excited to tell us about, like, from the book or since the book has been written, that highlight this quality of being the kind of person who makes ripple effects in the world?
Yeah. So there are, I mean, there are several people. Let's take. I'll take some examples, but I want to also say, some people are for and against all these people, so I'm just using them as um, kind of example of someone who made an impact. So one of them would be someone like Greta Thunberg. You know, she stood for something. It's not to say there were no climate scientists saying any of those things, and there was, of course, plenty of all of that already. She was just fairly unique in, and I think all of us are unique, but she stood up for it in a different way. And sometimes, the wind catches your sail, and if it takes off in the media and whatnot, um, you can make that difference. Another example is Malala, who, I mean, it's it's a, I mean, the story is crazy, but there are other women who stand up to terrorists. You know, it's just hers caught hold, took off that wind in the sail, and then but equally use so these are people who came from nowhere. Then there are others. Um, for me, I used to particularly follow Formula One quite closely, and there's a British Formula One driver, Lewis Hamilton, who really just changed so much of his life. He became a vegan. He sold his private jet. Started campaigning for various things. And so what he did was he used a platform that he had created for based on sport, and turned that to do, you know, kind of become a messenger for other critical issues. Now, whether that's right or wrong, or that's not the debate we're having here, but it's more examples of individuals who've stood for something and used either created a platform or used their platform to create that ripple effect.
Okay. So kind of like being the peak cheerleader where you have, a sort of power that can get you higher to get some amplification perhaps
Yeah.
about a kind of change. So that just if we can kind of hold that model in the mind of the kind of individual ripple effects that could happen, is the goal for you to start to convince people to raise their consciousness and become these kinds of, like, let's say, exemplary figures for inclusive economics?
So I think then the rise in consciousness is kind of a little bit independent. That is happening, and people have to discover that that's a journey that we all go on, and different, and our consciousness is different for different things. What I'm trying to appeal to is those people whose consciousness is rising, who are thinking on that, is saying, actually, let's look at the economics as well. You know, so yes, the planet matters, inequality, all this, but what is each of our participation in the economic model? Because one of the things is that we perpetuate it, like it or not. And when you look at the people who, like if you're lucky to live in a democratic country, you get to vote every 4 or 5 years, and say some midterms and things like that. But every day we vote several times a day with our money and our attention. And this actually is where our power lies. So, I mean, you can see in the US very recently with Tesla, kind of the backlash, and all of this has happened because people don't believe they have some belief and they don't agree with whatever. And therefore they are willing to make a different decision, so that they either foregone a purchase or made an alternate purchase. They've done something, and then some of them have taken to the streets, and some of them have broken the law. And like that goes further, but not at all saying that's the way to go. But just from a money perspective, choosing to buy something or not. In my case, my wife and I came off Amazon Prime, in 2021, because we didn't really subscribed to the way Amazon was kind of being run and extracted and all of these things. So there are different choices we can make, both with our money and our attention. And I think more and more I see the attention part being even more powerful than the money, because we may do 5 to 6 transactions a day, if that. That's quite, could be on the higher side. But with our attention, the platforms we go on, the content we consume, like that's even more powerful. That even like we do that on, they say an average is 5 to 6 hours a day that we spend on devices consuming content. So there's ways in which we can actually make that difference.
So in the book, the focus is really imagining a very big scale, though, right? A kind of global possibility for a different model of economics and what that would look like. Like, could you say just a little bit for us about models or real world examples you've seen where that difference in choices made by individuals creates a larger regional transformation in the model? And so there's almost like a divesting from one model of accumulation and a kind of rearticulation in a new one. Like, how did that equilibrium shift happen? Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
so it goes back to the co-op movement, which is, well, 150 or close to 200 years old, but then that got kind of rejuvenated. I think it was in the 60s. But the co-op model is a really interesting one, and we have some big successes. Vanguard, for example, many people don't even know actually which companies are co-ops and which are not. But you've got these, but they're all individual decisions. So in the case of Vanguard, it's Bogle who said, like, look, I want to create something for the common man, and he gave up billions in wealth to create Vanguard. And I think it's Warren Buffett who said that, Bogle, when after he passed, he said he did the most for, average American investors than anyone else. Similarly, in the UK, we have a couple of examples. One is the John Lewis Partnership, which is a huge departmental store, and roughly about 100 years ago, um, John Lewis was the man who started it, and he decided that he wanted to sort of shift the model. So all these co-ops are slightly different in the way they function. Vanguard, all of the people, the shareholders are the clients. In John Lewis' case, it's the staff, the employees. They are the shareholders. So that was one individual saying, "I want to do something different," and then created this model where today, John Lewis is over 100 years old, very profitable, and the thing is that it's not charity, So I wanted to also explain that John Lewis, for example, they pay what's called the living wage, which is about 20% higher than the minimum wage. And because they pay this extra salary to their staff, who also have a profit share in the business, the service that you get is a mark above, their competitors. And so, and then, I mean, the co-op movement is huge. There's several companies just using these as a handful of examples. And then the next one is the B Corp movement. And the B Corp movement, I would imagine, inspired by the co-op movement, but saying like, okay, you know what, we don't have to do this and make no profit, but instead of only profit, let's do the triple bottom line where it's people, planet, and profit. And that in this kind of 20 years old and has taken, now is, especially I think in the last 5 6 years has really taken off. And so I think between the co-op model, the B Corp models, and I think nowadays more people are just doing B Corps rather than co-ops. And it's these are different ways. And what it's saying is that, look, we can do business and we can all make money. We don't have to squeeze every last dollar out of, every transaction. We do not have to absolutely maximize. We can treat our staff fairly. We can treat our customers, like we can just be more human, and we can still make money, and we can still all thrive. So yeah, I think that's some of the examples. And I actually just quickly want to touch on Marcus's point on Robinhood. It so you do have what you have in this world is a number of companies who do a lot of washing in some way or the other, whether it's greenwashing, impact washing, whatnot. And in my view, Robinhood kind of ended up falling in that trap. Like they definitely wanted to democratize access, which they did in a large way, but then it became all about growth. And so I tell that story in the book as well. And so you end up. I've seen so much mission drift, in startups that I've worked in, and I used to do venture building, which is basically help startups scale. And I did that in inclusive fintech, which is this particular category where it's tech for good, and but investors want returns, and then at some point they just don't care anymore on your mission, and they just want you to do whatever it is that you need to do to hit those growth targets, and that's where the mission drift comes in.
I think this gets us to the sort of next kind of more ecological scale of the problem, right, that we're sort of stuck in. So there might be a kind of generational shift in consciousness that's like arising, and then these individuals who are capable of taking action in new ways, and then new attempts to create organizations or forms that can build from those intuitions to provide alternative values for economic sort of growth and social flourishing. But then each of those vectors or domains is cross-pollinating with other vectors or domains that also have some of these Robin Hood washers, and so suddenly you have the virtuous, let's say, B Corp or co-op that has to tangle with, let's say, an oligarchy is an example you come back to a lot in the book, right? Or a sort of corrupt institution of regulators who have alternative interests. How does somebody navigate, or how do you think about your model as these inevitable domain crossings put you in contact with players who may not be aligned with your values, but you also need to tangle with them because they come from interlocking other sectors of the world?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to be able to engage with them, because otherwise you'll create an island and you'll sit somewhere and then you likely just fail. To change the system, you have to change it from within. And so what I think I want to say two things here. So, and I'll come back to your point. What I found is that the next generation who are really thinking about these problems, they are now, especially the millennials, are in more powerful positions in very big organizations. So Mondelez is the chocolate, like they have so many of these chocolate brands and all this, and so these people are saying, it's not okay to exploit these cacao farmers. So we're going to do something about it. So even from within these big, large organizations who only really care about shareholder maximization, people are able to make a difference, because suddenly it's their remit, and they're following their values and passion, and like trying to make that difference. So there is, um, so I think when I'm going to now connect it to your original question, it's like it's very hard to paint all these companies with a broad brush. Like there are people within these companies who are also trying to do good and trying to actually make a difference. But so I think the point being that one is you have to interconnect with them, because otherwise you diminish your chances of success in the first instance. And two is that there is that change happening within those companies. And three, if we continue in the trajectory we are, and then more and more B Corps come, there is more chances you can interconnect with that ecosystem. So you don't have to be reliant on some of the companies that are, kind of dinosaurs and not willing to change with the times.
Super provocative. So I wonder if we have enough sort of, I guess, shared context to try to try something with you, which is, I thought it might be interesting to bring like almost like those call-in shows where you want advice or something like this. Like, can we, like, if we could bring you the super toughest problem we can think of, like where we really are stuck, and so that we can learn from each other's toughest problems and maybe start to assemble the kind of craft tricks and Avengers of how to sort out these nested issues. Does that sound like something could be?
Right? Yeah,
No,
totally.
okay. Yeah. So where I was, maybe we could, I don't know if you have one close to mind, but does anyone have like like Marcus, I'm going to pick on you again because you have often very hot takes. Like where you're like, this is the really tough one. This is the wall I hit when I try to think about how we're going to live in a different alternative model of like all things that I want to get to. How can we help? Or what kind of solution are you looking for?
All right. Yeah, so I didn't say in my introduction the work I do, but I work in like geospatial consulting. And I've done lots and lots of work over the years on like large suburban residential build outs and felt a sort of like somewhat of like an ethical dilemma in like making those like more efficient and making more of them, and making it so that like we can build out sprawl more efficiently when I'm personally more interested in like density and in urban build outs. So I made a shift in my career to use the same skills that I had to work more on like large solar farms, which was something I was more aligned with. Um, and like a broader question I had for you, which is like similar to this, is like I also consider myself like a wealth chaser, right? Like, I've always imagined that I would make millions and have a huge successful startup. But is there a sense in which like you kind of have to work within the industry first in order to gain up skills, to build up resources, to build up your network. And then like once you get a little bit of power, then you can start like making decisions on what you're more like ethically aligned with. And as you become more conscious, like using the skills you built up to like shift over to things that um that you agree with more. But yeah, that's like, do you sort of have to like start in the system that we're in order to like then branch out?
So typically, I would say yes. There are obviously exceptions, in two ways. So you have the folks like the Gates or the Zuckerbergs, so like who are very, very young and very successful, and you have a few people who are also in that age group who are with high consciousness. But those are very rare. So for the most part, in our 20s, like, well, at least I can speak for myself, didn't really know a great deal of and you just get sucked into the narrative, you know. People say, get a job, do this, do that, they're doing, firstly go to university. All of that's the narrative, right? Like, and so very much in the 20s, it's like about all like me, how do I do all those things? And then that slowly, as life unravels and you have different experiences, and you know um, that starts to shift. And so I wanted to be super rich, and I can remember from the age of 11 that was my goal. And that's only because society told me that means you'll be successful. It was kind of a metric of success. And you know I left investment banking when a friend of mine said to succeed in this industry, you need to be so greedy that you'd be willing to knock out your granny's teeth and melt the gold filling. And I realized at that time it wasn't for me. And I was very lucky because I left before the global financial crisis. And that meant, because when I say lucky, because if I didn't at that time, I probably wouldn't have lost my job and it would have been much harder to leave a paycheck, uh, in that time. So, um, and then I went on to meet my wife and all of this. So when I met her, I was already, entrepreneur, freelance, like not collecting a paycheck. So, for her, she had to accept that, or to make a different choice. Like so all of these things actually in the end they matter because that these define the direction in which your kind of career and life goes. For me, in that decade, 2010 to 2020, there was 6 times I almost made millions. But, you know, my grandmother used to say this, saying this, a slip between the cup and the lip, so you should say, be careful of that. And that's exactly what happened to me. One reason or the other, it was about, almost about to happen, and it didn't. And in one case, one of my startups sold to Twitter, for several millions and tens of millions, and I would have made a good chunk of it had I stayed in, but I didn't. I left, and when you leave, you get washed out. So next round of investment, they go like, we're not carrying this dead weight, so bye bye. Like, and uh, I don't regret any of those choices, but when COVID happened and I had this kind of deep thinking about, I realized I was part of the problem because having shifted to financial inclusion, I still wanted to make millions. And even if however inclusive your startup is, for me, solving problems for the poorest people in the world, if I made millions of that, even at huge scale, like I was just charging them too much. Like, so I'm not saying this is true for you because you could create, solar power, for example, and you can do it in a way that you're not overcharging or you're not, but the work I was doing, it was very much an issue. So I decided, so I spent a few years working at the UN in kind of like in between these two worlds, and now I'm building not-for-profit startups. So because I think that's the best way to create this inclusivity sorry, to include as many people as you can because there's less barriers, cost, and whatnot. So so I think that's a very personal decision. I'm not suggesting for a minute that everyone should follow this path. So I think to answer that question, like for most people, I think you need to it's very hard to do it out of the blocks like a Gates or Zuckerberg. Those are very rare. What typically happens is you get that deep knowledge, domain knowledge and expertise. Then you build your network. You also have by then some savings, some capital. You can and I mean the one of the things that some studies have said that the biggest factor of success in as a startup entrepreneur is timing. And that is not anything we really control. I mean, we can go with a mega trend, um, but turning up at the right time to do the right thing is kind of where it all lies. So I was able to shed this dream and desire for millions because when I asked myself, what do I want to do with these millions? It's like I want to do good. I want to, kind of give it away and make a difference to other people who are less fortunate. And that kind of made me realize I can do that. I can do that now because I can just shortcut the process because it might take me 20 more years to make millions. I may never make millions. Like why continue chasing that? Whereas now I can do the work I want to do, and there's enough money out there, philanthropic money, There's a lot of rich people who want to give away the money and do good and all of this. So the money exists more now than ever before. Even though it's kind of a turbulent climate at the moment, but in terms of quantum of capital available, it's massive. And so that's kind of where I've landed.
Can I ask a follow-up real quick?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Yeah, so here's the question. Do you think like someone like Andrew Carnegie was like a net benefit to society, right? So ran an incredibly extractive and monopolistic business, made tons of money, and then like gave most of it away to foundations and schools, education, later in life. Um, and part of that is a shift in consciousness, right? It's later in life realizing I don't know how much like he personally like would have said he did anything wrong, but changing his mind on like where that money should go. I think we've seen a similar shift with like Bill Gates. And maybe there's still time for like Elon Musk, and maybe there's still time for Zuckerberg and Bezos, but yeah, maybe there is still like effort to be put into shifting their consciousness as well.
Yeah, I think so. And like I said, some people will smoke no matter what. However, you put the image on the pack saying this is bad for you, this is, terrible, you're gonna get cancer and all of this, they still will do what they do. So I don't have any expectation that all of the billionaires are gonna rise, consciousness is gonna increase and they're all gonna shift. It's just that enough of them need to, and not necessarily only billionaires, like millionaire, people who look, we all won the postcode lottery, whether we're millionaires or not. The fact that we get to live the lives we live in itself is huge privilege. So recognizing that and doing something different with it, is sort of where the magic lies. And in the case of Carnegie, he came around, which is great and good for him because he could have made a whole set of different choices. So to answer your original question, I don't know whether he was net benefit or not, and across which period of time, it would also matter. But certainly, he made some different choices later on, which would probably benefit society. I think another part that I even question all of philanthropy in a way. And so later in the book, sort of in chapter 10, it's kind of like, why do we need philanthropists? Like, you know, and why do they need to get a tax credit? Because they effectively diminish the government's ability to do something so that they can do it. And then it's private and then it's their decisions. And it's like, so, and that's I can more macro thought, not against Gates or any one of these philanthropists, but saying like as society, as a culture, you know, questioning whether even that, as a mechanism, it, I think we would be better off if we had a more equitable tax regime and empowered, local governments, the citizen movements to make change and do what they think is right. Because I think anything top down, whether it's government or private, often misses the mark, because they don't really understand the needs of the people on the ground. So they're just trying to solve something from, a million miles away. And, I feel that's generally problematic.
Um, Andy, with your PFP is so beautiful, by the way. Do you have a question? What's the like toughest thing that hangs you up, or how can we help?
Hi, thank you. Android Jones is the artist from the picture. Yeah, he makes really cool visual art. I'm just quite curious. A couple of questions really. You spoke about things like the John Lewis partnership. Another one that comes to mind in the UK is the Co-op, which is like a supermarket and they do funerals and banking, I think, as well. Why do you think that hasn't caught on? Like there's a couple of them and I'm successful, but it's not really like a business model that other people have adopted. It's just a few outliers. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think a couple of decades ago, 2 out of 10 companies were co-ops. I don't know what that number is now. This is some research done by the Institute of Business. Someone had done it. I haven't found anything more recent, but I would imagine that's a lot less now. And um, there, I guess the way capital got allocated, the venture capital industry kind of killed the co-op model, because basically you ended up in this situation that it's the person with the most capital could suffer losses and gain market share and then turn up the price. So as that model took hold in the 80s, a little bit, 90s more, and then in the last 20 years, a hell of a lot more, it has completely changed the dynamic. Luckily for us, the B Corp movement, kind of started in 2004 or 5 and kind of countered it, because the B Corp movement said, okay, well, we can still take investment and equity, you can invest in us, but we're going to do all these things and you'll still get a return, but you're not going to get, we're just going to shift that focus. And maybe you actually get a greater return, because there are some very, very successful B Corps. Just, like they said in the John Lewis thing, when you empower people, it means you can get better results. It's not just a case of kind of charity. So I think that's kind of how the landscape shifted. Now you have banks like Coutts in the UK, which is a small private bank, who also become a B Corp, because the generational shift, as the next generation inherited their money, they were like, we don't want to support a bank who's just furthering fossil fuel investments and that sort of thing. So it's been really interesting how so much change is happening based on again, this shift of consciousness, and people are moving their pensions. There's another one that I really like called bank.green, or is it green.bank? Green.bank, I think it is. And you can go on there and you can check to see how green your bank is. And you can switch to another bank, and then they write a breakup letter on your behalf and send it to the bank saying, I'm no longer banking with you because you are, doing all this fossil fuel investment. So this is kind of the tools and the shift that's happening.
Another thing I wanted to ask your opinion on. So you spoke about companies, corporations, maybe they need to not focus so much on extracting maximum profit, and doing good, and speaking about B Corps and stuff like that. I think now I'm a bit cynical about it, but a lot of like big corporations and brands do support like the whatever cause is trending at the current time, and it's kind of like a bit of a moral offset. So, you know, what they do is perhaps only in the pure interest of making money, but then I don't want to undermine that they support various causes, but it does sometimes feel like they're just jumping on the bandwagon and it's like a almost virtue signaling. So the question really linked to that is there a way to encourage corporations and brands to do stuff that is more meaningful? So I think I haven't had a chance to read your book, but I think one of the things you mention is people around the world getting a bank account to help them manage their money more effectively. But obviously that's something that's very time consuming, expensive to implement. So how could we get companies to invest their profits into things that have more social value rather than profit?
Yeah, so I think to answer the first question, since about 2016, we live in a post-truth world, where, I mean, people always lied and, propaganda and all this, but now it's so blatant. It's just like people just say whatever they want for the sake of saying it. So as people and citizens, we need to be able to discern that, and I think, there's been a failure of critical thinking because the schooling system also has just been this very much rote attainment, learn these things, do this, get these marks. So, but the ability to think critically about and really question what they're saying and if that is really true. And now, of course, we can't do it across the board all the time. We don't have that kind of time. And that's where, again, the B Corp certification helps us, right? Because it's a process, there's audit, they certify that the companies are doing what they, all of the different criteria that you need to comply with to become a B Corp. And there are also examples of companies that were B Corp certified, but turned out they didn't follow the things, and then they lost their certification. So I think that those things help. I mean, you saw with the DEI turnout, U-turn that so many companies made in the last few months. Like, it's so clear that they never really cleared. So for now, it's like the next time they say, "Oh, we care about this," it'll be like, yeah, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, right? Like, so now that's I have this hopefully longer than 9-day memory that in order to remember that these were the companies who really were flip-flopping based on the fashion of the hour, rather than having solid value-based principles. And so that was the kind of the first question. And so just remind me again the second question, the thing you touched on in the end.
Like how to encourage brands and corporations to focus more on things
Yeah.
with tangible social value rather than making themselves look good.
Yeah. So I think, the CSR movement, which is the corporate social responsibility, the ESG movement as well, which all of these have been attempts at trying to drive that change to say, okay, you know what, Google, you made so many billion, but you wouldn't have been able to do that if the population was illiterate. So somebody else paid for the population to learn, how to read and write and all of this. So, at some point, there's a cycle here that you can kind of do. So many corporates now have a foundation arm and are looking to do that. Now, again, how much. In some cases, the foundation arm is just helping the business in a different way. Some cases, it's purely a foundation arm that's completely detached from the business that is doing some good. So it's a lot of gray. But I think many companies and brands are thinking about this because it matters to their employees. Their employees are kind of demanding, like, so I give you another example. 20 years ago, and I think most of us are old enough, we would have, come out of university, gone for an interview. It's one way. We get peppered with questions. We answer all the questions and hope we get the job. And today, that's not the case. Today, it's a two-way interview. The candidate is interviewing the company. What about this? What about that? How do you deal with this? Like, why should I join you? Like, it's not a given that I'm going to just take your offer. And that's another shift, that's a generational thing. And so it forces these companies to say, oh, we didn't think of that. We don't have an answer, and we're not able to attract the best talent because we don't, answer these questions. So, so I think there's kind of progress on this front. Is it where we need it to be? Absolutely not. Plenty more to go. But at least these green shoots, the direction of travel is sort of positive.
Cool, thank you.
What is the toughest thing you're hitting, or in the sort of quest to change how everything works, and how can we help?
Yeah, this conversation is very interesting to me, although some of yeah, it's a new domain for me. And it's speaking mainly from the positions of I think examining, participating in bettering the values of maybe these players who have capital leverage already, right? And as I said before, I work with much more marginalized communities, people whose sense of cooperative economics is based in survival, is not necessarily able to leverage their values to the fullest degree because they are either left out of markets or left out of the scale of markets. So things like social and cooperative capital around passing the same $20 back and forth, or feeding each other, or like figuring out how to build these capital structures outside of banking, outside of business, is kind of my scope. And so I don't know if I have a explicit question so much as I'm interested in what inclusive economics means for what financial inclusion means for bringing people out of poverty, and how we can keep communal values intact as we scale into financial inclusion and economic inclusion. And so I'd love just some more thoughts and attention on your research and experience for people in those other domains.
Sure, that's fascinating. So thanks so much. I have a few things to point to. I think, like these communities, the biggest problem is capital. So there are efforts, there's one that's called grassroots economics, where they create a currency that people are able to use. Because very often you have just a liquidity issue. There is demand, there is supply, but there's just no liquidity to pay for it. So that's one way. The other thing very close to my heart is, and kind of I have these multiple questions I think about for the long term, like how do we solve? And one of them is, how do we provide capital to these communities at a rate that is, either equivalent or cheaper than what we can access? Because the big problem we have today is that you and I get capital quite cheap, and we can, and these people from these communities, it's like 10x, 20x. And if it was flipped, we could actually afford to pay those rates. Not that we'd want to, but we could afford it. They absolutely can't. And so then it just becomes a fulfilling prophecy. You say the risk is high, so I'm going to jack up the interest rate, and then you make it harder for them to pay back. And so then naturally there's more debt and more default. And so that's a cycle that, economics, absolutely expensive to be poor in so many ways. And economics doesn't currently solve for that. In fact, HBR had this case study on a shampoo in India. It was called Sunsilk. They created these sachets. So they gave you 10 ml of shampoo, and you can, wash your hair, and, I think it was either one-time use or something like that, although people will try to make it last for 2 uses or things like that. But the unit cost, whilst they knocked it down at a point which people could afford it, but when you kind of calculate the cumulative total of buying those sachets versus the bottle, they paid an exorbitant premium. So This is where economics today, fails the bottom end of society. The other thing I want to talk about is I ended up doing a fair bit of research on the First Nation communities, and so in chapter 11, I actually talk about that because they had it sorted much better than we do today, and so there's this really interesting model, and I think many communities today, even the poorer ones, they do some, they really are very tight knit. So there's this work and research done called the Diaries of the Poor, and it really examines the life of people who live on $2 a day. And on average, they had 9 financial instruments. So even though they were earning $2, these were all informal, but someone who earns $2 a day, believe it or not, is also richer than some other people in their community. So they were lending people, there was loans, but they were also taking loans. They were, like saving in cattle, different ways in which they live their lives. And so there's this myth about like poor people are not smart with money. I mean, that is not true at all. In fact, it's the opposite. Their struggles are so great that they have to be good. They have to be far better than any of us. They're not going to fall for some Instagram ad, and they're not going to buy something they don't need. Whereas all of us on this call, very high probability of us buying something we don't need, because we got hooked, like some heartstring got pulled. Like the advertising whole industry is completely geared up to do this, right? So I think there's a lot of value there. The in terms of financial inclusion and why that matters still, even though they have kind of this informal structures, is kind of like financial instruments are like also quite valuable. So every year, 30% of the people who come out of poverty go back into poverty because of an insurance, because of a shock which insurance could have covered. It's a health shock or a death in the family or something that has occurred that they just don't have the wherewithal to. But if it could provide insurance, and that's a nice, like a surefire way of being able to help them out. And that's something that communities haven't really managed to do. They have a lot of community savings efforts, but in terms of distributing risk across either a community or large, like it's been much harder because actuaries and also, the way the insurance industry works, like it's very hard to insure just one community. You need to insure multiple communities because if there's a drought, then it just doesn't work. The numbers don't add up to be able to. You can't pay out to everyone. You need to have collected insurance premium from so many different areas, such that you're only paying out a portion of that. So, we talked about credit, being able to access really inexpensive credit. And I think there are ways in which that can happen because the social contracts that exist in these small communities are very powerful. So if we tap into those, then, people will support each other to make sure that they repay. Um, and that's one big area. And then insurance, I would say, is the other. So, that would really help their current situations.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful responses and everyone's amazing engagement. I have to go now, so thank you and best of luck in growing consciousness and economic inclusion all around. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for your work,
Yeah.
for doing what you're doing in the world. Trey, did you want to add something to the set of questions?
I was wondering, if there could be anything changed from maybe the legal perspective, because one of the biggest problems in the US, I feel like, is our judicial system, torts especially, is just out of control. Uh, People will sue for outrageous things, but then insurance companies have to respond with higher prices, and businesses are hit, and it seems that everybody suffers except for a few attorneys and the very few people who sue. And granted, some of the, I mean, I'm not talking about legitimate lawsuits, but when everything can go to court and just the expense of defending it, you know, um, is incredibly high, it's like that. It seems like there's just a better way to do it. And even for the legitimate ones, it's like when there's a beef, now, I'm actually dealing with customer service from Amazon. They and it's like they sent me one volume instead of two volumes of a very expensive book, and it's like not a big deal, but you know, I had to search really hard to find customer service on the site. It's like, you know, they want to get away from that, but at the same time, $100, I'm not gonna file a lawsuit. Um, so it's just the interaction between companies and the customer, you know, even, and I've been a customer since 98 or 99 with that Amazon. So like forever, to date myself, you know, um, it's like there's so much room for improvement. And at the same time, I think everybody is on the same side. It's like, yeah, it's a problem. I don't know if that works into any of it as well.
Yeah, I think, Trey, that's a fascinating question, and these are topics that I actually cover in the book quite a bit, because this idea of so just I'll do it in order of what you brought it up in. The first one, in terms of, so I don't think necessarily is some legal change you can make, because we are, like, especially in the US, you got so much legal stuff already that maybe too much in that sense. But what it comes down to is consciousness, in and what it is. So the people who are willing to make these outrageous lawsuits and use the law in all that, their consciousness, is, in that regard, is typically quite low, in that they just want to use the system to benefit themselves. And so you always got to have these people. The question is, how many, and how, like, versus, um, if everybody tries to do that. So I think for me, that's what it comes down to. Then on your second point on customer service, and so I used to be a grade one to fight with every business which I thought did wrong by me, like, and here you gave a great example, Amazon, they ship the thing and whatnot. Um, you know, there's a flip side to this as well. Like, if Amazon shipped you two volumes and you only bought one, chances are you're gonna be like, oh, that's great. And not you, Trey, but all of it. Like, are we really going to go through the effort to ship it back to them? And do they even care? Actually, in most parts, they just, they for them it doesn't matter. But what I realized is this, and what I talk about in the book, is this shift from a scarcity mindset to abundant mindset. Because we tell ourselves it's the principle that we're fighting for, but it really rarely is. It's mostly the money. Even though you're saying $100 and you're willing to let it go or not take them to court for it, but you're not actually still willing to let it go. You want to find their customer service thing. So for me, I realized I was better off just letting it go rather than fighting the fight. And it just allowed me to focus my energies on other things rather than getting bogged down by these issues. But also, it's an opportunity to make a different choice. So where a business has really blatantly done something wrong, then I have to think about, do I actually really want to do business with them again? Because clearly, Amazon, they just don't care. You know, 30 years, or coming up to 30 years of being a customer is, it's literally meaningless for a huge organization like that. they're not putting any premium, because if they did, they would have some algorithm that says any query from a customer who has spent more than 100,000 or whatever thousand in a number of years, they could have easily some metrics that say just give trade a refund without asking another question. Like they don't need to even have a customer service person look through it or whatever. They could automate it if they wanted to, but they don't. So in terms of customer service, though, I mean, there's so many times it's so frustrating, because not that you want money or something, you just need to change something or a date, or especially with airlines, and you'll be on hold with them for 45 minutes, and then you get somebody who says the system doesn't allow me to do this and that. So sometimes it's not even money, it's just you can't get what you need. My hope is that AI solves some of these problems in a kind of meaningful way. But the jury's out on that. Let's see, in the coming years.
Tina?
I think everyone had such a fantastic perspectives today. I'm really enjoying hearing that. In terms of like some of the challenges that like I was thinking about a lot, it was actually like really touches on Arunjay, what you were saying very recently, and quality is kind of like a problem. I think a lot about kind of like when we're designing systems, policies, I think a lot about who gets in, who gets out, the sampling strategy fundamentally for those. And I think that can potentially, both from data science perspective and also from like that economic business perspectives, I think it makes a world of a difference for that individual within that system if they get help, meaningful help, or if their lives get completely shattered, right? So it's that's kind of like a lot of what I was thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, the way it's currently thought of is collateral damage. So it's just like we do these policies, it's going to benefit the vast majority. At least that's the hope. I can't say that's true for all policies. Certainly, it's not for many. But it's very hard with a broad brush to solve problems for people, and so you're always going to get someone who's in the wrong end of the holds the wrong end of the stick, and for them, this is a micro issue that's devastating. And I can say in the UK we have a few issues here. Particularly, there's a two child benefit cap, for example. So if you have third child, you don't get benefits. So it's the way that the state is saying that you should not have more than two children. But poorer people typically have more children because for various reasons historically and otherwise. So it's not to say so. So what we end up in a situation now is, even though this policy is in place, people are not saying, oh, you know what, I'm not going to get the benefits, I better stop at two. They're actually having more kids. And so their lives is rather difficult. The other side of it is there's a lot of stigma attached to applying for benefits. In all Western countries, primarily because they're the ones that offer social benefits. There is that social stigma. So you need the benefits, but if you're seen queuing up to get those, like that's just not going to look good for you within your kind of community. So there's that issue, and then the other one is the complexity in applying for these for the benefits as well. So all of policies is very complicated, and there's a really good book. The name's not coming to mind at the moment, but it's written. It's someone in the U.S. wrote it, and it's a lady, and it was all about bureaucracy and why it's so complex. And the thing is that her example was when the book says, like when the law says you could do this, or you could do that, or you could do the other. Some bureaucrat will say, look, I need to be careful here. I need to just make sure nothing goes wrong. So I'll say, you need to do this and that and the other. So they just turn the or into and therefore it's just complexity is now to the power of three. And that's just one example of how these things become so complex. So yeah, I mean, solving. I'm a great believer in, the kind of the citizen, that like the bottom up approach, and doing it that way. And some countries have proven that to be very successful. Taiwan is one example, and where that, when policy is created like more locally, the smaller the policy, the more chances you are to get it right and give better coverage to the people, and so those sort of things.
Okay, I'm going to selfishly add mine too, because I think I have come to this belief that we should get all the toughest problems on the table as soon as possible. So we have the largest runway to, solving them for ourselves. Like, let's tell the kindergartners all the things we need, So I guess one thing that I just really appreciated the breadth of your book and the scope of it and the way that you can see all of these other worlds poking through, that you've touched or been involved with. And so I think the stuck point for me is really like, when you become somebody who wants to make a difference and you've come through enough domains and you have enough privilege that there's nothing left but the really big ambitious problems, right? To score a win for humanity, right? Then you realize, oh no, we don't need everybody, but 1 million more people with some degree of coordination sure would help a lot, right? So who or where are the places coming to mind where you can see pockets of that kind of flywheel happening between or across very heterogeneous players, so that there's like an emergence possible of different forms we haven't seen or modes of coordination that can give us some scalability into a paradigm shift, right? How are we going to do the part that is more than the sum of the parts?
Yeah, Erica, that's a great question and a really hard one. So I'm going to do my best to answer this. So citizens assembly, which is kind of the word, I didn't use that word, but what I was referring to in Tina's question is one way in which we're seeing that happen. Like I said, Taiwan is a really good example. And there's a book by, his name is John Alexander. And yeah, I try and search for it and send. But he actually collects a lot of examples of how that change is happening. And I think they're also, so one organization that I support is Acumen, and I feel like they are really trying to create that flywheel with philanthropic capital, investing it in startups and in fellows, and they're one of probably a dozen at their scale, the Ashoka Foundation and other, and a few, kind of few more, who are really focused on empowering individuals through this fellowship and kind of creating and giving them grants and capital to also make a difference. So there have been, but overall it's still few and far between. So this is where our work, like this is what we need to do much more of, and find ways in which to use this as inspiration, but also like multiply it.
So then I think the question becomes, reading, being inspired, sharing, multiplying, those are gifts you give us, right? What gift can we give you? What do you need? And what's the toughest question that's now the new horizon of where you are thinking and where you want to go next?
Thank you, Erica. That's a really interesting question. So I think a year on since I wrote the book, because when I published it, I just started the Inclusive Action Lab, and this is a incubator for non-profit startups, not-for-profit startups. This is something I'm very passionate about, and I have two projects that are in the that are currently being incubated. So one of them is a proxy addressing service, like primarily for payments, but can be used for other things, is like the DNS of the internet, but for payments. So your Venmo and PayPal work on proxies, where you can just use your mobile number rather than the bank account. And when you think of the internet, the bank account is like the IP address, and the domain is like this easy, memorable name, like an email or a phone number. And all of these current providers, like even though Venmo, PayPal exist and lots who use this, they're all like digital islands. So they're like ISPs without being connected to other ISPs. So it only works when you're on their network. You can't Venmo the money to somebody who's not on Venmo. And yeah, so that's one project which is really about bringing together financial institutions. The other project, which is more sort of grassroots, is around secondary education. So not reinventing, but more progressive education, like fit for purpose on what, because the old models are about compliance and attainment. So you comply with everything the school tells you to comply with, from a uniform to timetables and everything, all kind of setting you up for this 9 to 5 world where you become a follower and not a leader. That's this current schooling system. And so shifting that to really helping people build these core skills of resilience, critical thinking, just figuring out who they are, because you go through all of school just kind of being mind washed, and then you have to spend your 20s and your 30s, maybe longer, so trying to figure out who you are and what you want to do in life. And like, so there's the like, we can shortcut that whole process to just really do better for young adults, young kids, young people. And so that's that project. And the reason it's, again, not for profit is because we want to open source everything, all of the methodology, and so that's the idea there. So anyone anywhere can start a school and drive this change.
So should we be starting schools as well?
Well, I think so on this project, my co-founder here, she's an educator. She spent 20 years in education. So I think the answer is yes, but the we is more, like the people who have, to Marcus's earlier question, who's the right person? Like, we all have some domain expertise. And, so my primary work is still in financial inclusion and payments, and so I think, yeah, it's more matter of finding, or like getting. I think people, like, in education also are fed up with the system. It's not like the teachers are having a great time of it. They are frustrated and struggling with the demands that keep increasing against the time they have available, and like there are a lot of things that are broken in the system. And working in the university, Erica, this firsthand, the shift that's happened in the last decade or so. Like, everyone wants more of everything. So this maximization is not always just about money. It's about knowledge, and it's about time. It's like everything, every aspect. And so, yeah, I think we definitely need to be thinking about this very broadly, and how we can drive the change that we want to for the generations to come as well.
Thank you for doing this with us and talking about Generation Hope and the sort of model and way of approaching these problems that you have devoted a life so far to. And we're so grateful, I think, that you are where you are so early with time on the clock, and that there are decades ahead for all of the kind of building and community and conversations that haven't happened yet. Like, that's so exciting, you know? So it would be really cool to like check back in like 18 to 24 months or 12 months, right? And sort of think about a kind of longitudinal series of what happens when you're living on the other side of a consciousness transformation, you know, and to kind of think about the biography of the ripple effects if you're game for it.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. And I want to say I've been challenged before because, you know, one gentleman told me that, you know, he sees what I'm saying, but he says equally people are more selfish today than more this, you know, like all of this. So I do also want to acknowledge that it's not like we live in this world where, you know, everyone is trying to make it a better place. And so there are these polarities. And I think one of the messages that I try to bring in the book is that we actually don't need to sit on two ends of a spectrum. You know, just meeting in the middle quite often is the way to go.
thank you. And it's such a pleasure to see everyone. Any final bits, or I think we have about 2 minutes. I don't want to take the last bit if. Fantastic. Okay, so I'll just mention again, like, this is my first time doing one of these. Like, so
Well, you've done a great job.
if there's feedback on the craft and there's things that can set the table better, like, I'm super happy to be in conversation as well, to make that experience more pleasurable and interesting. Yeah, productive.
No, I think Erica, like this was fantastic. I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and also to all of y'all who asked these difficult questions. Thank you for your time and for posing them. And you know, we are Generation Hope, so you know we can make the difference.
Have a wonderful day, all.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Arunjay.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you
So good
both.
to meet you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Tina. Thank you, Trey.